Sometimes the most powerful force in a dying town isn't money or guns. It's a teacher who refuses to give up on her students. In the dust-swept frontier town of Willow Bend, schoolteacher Clara Whitmore teaches children in an abandoned stable because no one cares enough to build them a real school. When wealthy ranch heir Matthew Calder rides back into town with more money than purpose, Clara sees her chance. She makes him a deal that shocks everyone. Build her a proper schoolhouse, and she'll consider his marriage proposal. What starts as a simple wager becomes something much deeper. Matthew must battle crooked merchants, suspicious neighbors, and his own father's disapproval. But Clara's dream isn't just about education. It's about saving a town that's forgotten how to hope. The real danger comes when rival ranchers decide that keeping Willow Bend ignorant serves their plans better. They're willing to burn more than books to stop progress from taking root. Can one determined teacher and a cowboy, learning to find his purpose, save a town from those who profit from its despair? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass bell in Clara Whitmore's hand had seen better days, much like everything else in Willow Bend. Its surface bore the green patina of neglect, and the clapper hung slightly loose, but when she rang it each morning at 8 o'clock sharp, the sound still carried across the dusty main street with all the authority she could muster. Today, like every day for the past 2 years, she stood outside Henderson's abandoned stable and watched her students emerge from the shadows between buildings. They came in worn boots and patched clothing, carrying slate boards and precious few books, but their faces lit up when they heard that bell. 7 children this morning, down from 12 last month, when the Parkers packed up their wagon and headed back east. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," chorused young Annie Morrison, her blonde braids bouncing as she hurried toward the makeshift schoolhouse. Behind her trailed her younger brother Tommy, dragging his feet through the dust with the reluctance of an 8-year-old boy who'd rather be anywhere else. Clara smiled warmly at them both, though her heart ached, knowing that their father, Jake Morrison, would likely pull them from school before winter. He'd made his feelings about book learning clear enough at the last town meeting. The stable smelled of hay and old leather, with dust motes dancing in the slanted beams of morning sunlight that filtered through gaps in the weathered boards. Clara had done her best to transform the space into something resembling a proper classroom. She'd scrubbed every surface until her knuckles bled, arranged salvaged chairs and desks donated by departing families, and hung maps and alphabet charts she'd purchased with her own meager salary. In the corner sat her pride and joy, a small shelf lined with 37 books. Some were her own from her teaching college back in Pennsylvania. Others were donations from families who'd decided that books were too heavy for their westward journey. Each volume was precious, handled with the reverence one might reserve for Holy Scripture. "Now then," Clara said, smoothing her navy wool skirt as she moved to the front of the room, "who can tell me what we learned yesterday about the founding of our great republic?" 12-year-old Sarah Fleming's hand shot up immediately. The girl was sharp as a tack, with a mind that devoured knowledge, the way prairie grass soaked up spring rain. Her father ran the general store, one of the few businesses still thriving in Willow Bend, and he understood the value of education. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, Miss Whitmore. It declared that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Excellent, Sarah. And why do you think our founding fathers believed education was so important for a democracy? Before Sarah could answer, the stable door creaked open, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Matthew Calder stood silhouetted against the morning light, his tall frame filling the doorway. He wore a black Stetson pushed back on his dark hair, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were expensive tailored trousers, a fine linen shirt, and those silver spurs that marked him as a man who'd never done an honest day's work in his life. The children turned to stare. Matthew Calder was something of a legend in Willow Bend, though not the kind parents wanted their children to emulate. At 28, he was the heir to the largest cattle ranch in 3 territories, and he spent his inheritance on gambling, drinking, and women with the enthusiasm of a man who'd never learned the value of a dollar earned through sweat. "Don't mind me," Matthew said, touching the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. "Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Heard tell there's a schoolmarm in town who thinks she can work miracles." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "We're in the middle of a lesson, Mr. Calder. You're welcome to observe quietly, or you can return when school is dismissed." Matthew's mouth quirked in a half-smile that probably melted hearts from here to Denver. "Oh, I'll stay if it's all the same to you, Miss Whitmore. Might learn something myself." He leaned against the doorframe with studied casualness, but Clara noticed the way his eyes moved around the room, taking in the patched walls, the mismatched furniture, the children's eager faces turned toward her like flowers following the sun. "As I was saying," Clara continued, determined not to let his presence derail her lesson, "education is the foundation of freedom. A people who cannot read cannot govern themselves. They become dependent on others to interpret the world for them." "And what if those others have their own interests at heart?" Sarah asked, her young face serious. "Then the people suffer," Clara replied simply. "Knowledge is power, children. It's the one thing no one can take from you once you possess it." Matthew shifted against the doorway, and Clara caught his slight frown. Good. Perhaps he was beginning to understand why she fought so hard for this ramshackle classroom, why she refused every offer of marriage that would take her away from Willow Bend. The lesson continued for another hour, covering arithmetic, geography, and literature. Clara watched with satisfaction as her students' minds engaged with the material, asking questions that showed they were truly thinking, not merely reciting. This was why she'd come west, not for adventure or a husband, but to plant seeds of knowledge in fertile young minds. When she finally dismissed the children at noon, Matthew remained by the door, seemingly in no hurry to leave. "Quite a performance," he said once the last child had disappeared into the street. Clara bristled. "This isn't a performance, Mr. Calder. It's education, in a stable, in the only building I could secure for the purpose." Matthew pushed away from the doorframe and walked deeper into the room, his spurs jingling softly with each step. He paused before her makeshift blackboard, a piece of slate propped against the wall, and studied the day's arithmetic problems. "You really think this matters?" he asked, gesturing around the shabby space. "I know it does." "How?" Clara set down her teaching bell and faced him squarely. "Because I've seen what happens to places where ignorance takes root. I've seen good people manipulated by those who count on their inability to read contracts or understand their rights. I've seen children grow up believing they're destined for nothing more than the circumstances of their birth. And you think a few books and some fancy Eastern ideas can change that? I think knowledge can change everything." Matthew studied her face for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, not mockery, but not belief either. "You've been here 2 years, Miss Whitmore. In that time, how many families have left Willow Bend?" The question stung because Clara knew the answer. 17. "And how many new ones have arrived?" 3. "This town is dying, Clara. May I call you Clara?" He didn't wait for permission. "Your little school isn't going to save it." "Perhaps not," she admitted. "But it might save the children who are still here. It might give them choices their parents never had." Matthew walked to the small bookshelf and picked up a volume of Shakespeare, running his fingers over the worn cover. "You really believe that, don't you?" "With all my heart." He was quiet for so long that Clara began to think the conversation was over. Then he turned to face her, and she saw something new in his storm-grey eyes, a flicker of what might have been respect. "What would it take?" he asked quietly. "I beg your pardon, to give these children what you think they deserve. A real school, proper desks, books for every child, maybe even a bell tower for that brass bell of yours. What would it take?" Clara's heart began to race. "Mr. Calder, are you—" "Answer the question," She took a shaky breath. $2,000, maybe three, if we wanted it done right. Stone foundation, proper windows, a wood-burning stove for winter, and shelves for a real library. That's a considerable sum. It's a considerable dream. Matthew nodded slowly, then fixed her with a look that made her pulse quicken, for reasons that had nothing to do with education or schools. "I've been thinking about settling down," he said. "My father's been after me to find a wife, start a family. You're a handsome woman, Clara Whitmore, and you've got more backbone than any female I've ever met." Clara felt her cheeks burn. "Mr. Calder, I hardly think." "Hear me out," he held up a hand. "I'll build you your school. $3,000, maybe $4 if that's what it takes to do it right. Modern desks, proper books, everything on your list. And in return?" Matthew's smile was slow and devastating. "You marry me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're not serious. Dead serious. Best offer you're likely to get in a town like this. You think you can buy me?" "I think we can help each other. You want your school. I want a wife who won't bore me to tears over breakfast for the next 40 years. His expression softened slightly. "I've been watching you, Clara. The way you fight for these children, the way you refuse to give up even when everyone else has. That's the kind of woman I want standing beside me." Clara's hands trembled as she picked up her teaching bell, needing something solid to anchor her. "This is madness." "Is it? You said yourself that knowledge is power. Well, here's power enough to give every child in Willow Bend the education they deserve. All you have to do is say yes. And if I say no?" Matthew shrugged, but she caught the flash of disappointment in his eyes. "Then you'll keep teaching in Henderson's stable until the roof caves in or the last family leaves town, whichever comes first." Clara stared at him, weighing his words against the dream she'd carried for 2 years. A real school, proper books, a chance to truly change these children's lives. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need," Matthew said, settling his hat back on his head. "But don't take too long. Winter's coming, and this stable won't keep anyone warm when the snow starts falling." He tipped his hat to her with that maddening half-smile. "Good day, Miss Whitmore. I'll be curious to hear your answer." After he left, Clara sank into her chair and stared at the brass bell in her hands. The metal was warm from her touch, and she could almost hear the ghost of all the morning lessons it had called to order. Outside, Willow Bend dozed in the afternoon heat, a town caught between hope and surrender. And somewhere in that drowsing stillness, the future of every child in her makeshift classroom hung in the balance of one impossible decision. Clara spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with Matthew Calder's proposition before she made her decision. On Thursday morning, she arrived at the stable early, lit the oil lamp, and sat with her hands folded, waiting for the sound of spurs on the wooden step. Matthew appeared at 8:15, just as the children were filing in for morning lessons. He nodded to her politely but took his place against the wall without a word, watching as she led the students through their recitations. When she dismissed them for recess, Clara remained at her desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Well?" Matthew asked, his voice carefully neutral. Clara stood and smoothed her grey wool skirt, drawing herself up to her full height. "I accept your terms, Mr. Calder. Build me a proper school, and I'll consider your marriage proposal." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or relief. "Consider? That was your exact wording, if I recall. You said I should consider your proposal, not accept it outright." Clara lifted her chin. "I'm a woman of my word, Mr. Calder, but I'm not a fool. Build the school first. Then we'll discuss the rest." Matthew's eyes narrowed, but after a moment he threw back his head and laughed. "Fair enough, Miss Whitmore. I should have expected a schoolteacher to pay attention to the fine print." He pushed away from the wall and extended his hand. "Partners, then?" Clara hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His palm was warm and calloused, more so than she'd expected from a man with his reputation. "Partners? Good. I'll ride into town tomorrow morning and start making arrangements. Where did you have in mind for the location? Clara had been thinking about this question for 2 years. There's a clearing just west of Main Street, near the creek. It's high enough to avoid flooding, close enough for the children to walk, and there are cottonwoods for shade. I know the spot. Matthew frowned. That's Henderson's land. Mr. Henderson said I could use it when I first arrived. He seemed to think having a school nearby might attract new families. Henderson's been dead for 6 months, Clara. His nephew back in Missouri inherited the property. Clara's stomach dropped. But surely nothing. Legal ownership is legal ownership. Matthew's expression grew thoughtful. I'll send a telegram to Missouri. See if we can work something out. Might cost extra. How much extra? Hard to say. Could be $50, could be $500, depending on how greedy the nephew is. Clara sank back into her chair, the weight of the obstacle settling over her like a heavy blanket. Perhaps we should choose another location. Let me handle it. Matthew's voice carried a confidence that Clara wished she shared. I've dealt with land disputes before. Money has a way of solving most problems. Over the next week, Clara watched Matthew transform from idle heir to determined businessman. He spent hours at the telegraph office, sending and receiving messages about property rights, lumber prices, and construction schedules. He met with the Territorial Land Office, consulted with surveyors, and even visited the blacksmith to discuss custom-made nails. The town began to take notice. At Morrison's general store, conversations quieted when Clara entered. Women gathered in small groups on street corners, their voices dropping to whispers when she passed. Some watched with obvious skepticism, others with cautious hope. Heard tell Matthew Calder's fixing to build you a schoolhouse, said Mrs. Fleming one afternoon as Clara purchased supplies. That true? Mr. Calder has made a generous offer to support education in Willow Bend, Clara replied carefully. And what's he expecting in return? The question came from Jake Morrison himself, who emerged from behind a stack of feed sacks with a scowl on his weathered face. Clara met his stare steadily. The satisfaction of helping children learn to read and write, Mr. Morrison. The same satisfaction any decent person would feel. Morrison snorted. Matthew Calder's never done anything decent in his life without expecting something back. You'd best be careful, Miss Whitmore. Man like that doesn't part with his money for nothing. Perhaps you underestimate him. No, perhaps you do the same. That evening, Clara was sweeping the stable classroom when Matthew appeared in the doorway, his face grim. We have a problem, he said without preamble. Clara set down her broom. The land? The land. Matthew stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Henderson's nephew doesn't want to sell. Says he's got his own plans for the property. What kind of plans? Wouldn't say, but he's not interested in any amount of money I can offer. Clara felt her dreams crumbling like old mortar. Then we'll find another location. It's not that simple. Matthew ran a hand through his dark hair, disturbing the careful part. I've been asking around town, trying to understand the lay of the land, so to speak. There's something else going on here, Clara, something bigger than a schoolhouse. What do you mean? Matthew walked to her small shelf of books and picked up a volume of Whitman, turning it over in his hands. You ever wonder why so many families have left Willow Bend? Why businesses are failing, even though the land's still good and the water's still clean? Times are hard everywhere. Not this hard. Not this systematic. He set the book down and faced her. Someone's been buying up property as fast as people abandon it, offering just enough money to help folks get out of town, but not enough to make them rich. Clara frowned. Who? That's what I'm trying to figure out. The purchases are all handled through a lawyer in Denver, but the real buyer stays anonymous. Whoever it is now owns about half the town and most of the good grazing land around it. But what does that have to do with the school? Matthew's expression darkened. Think about it, Clara. What's the one thing that keeps families in a failing town? Clara considered the question, her teacher's mind working through the possibilities. Hope, the belief that things will get better. And what gives parents hope for their children's future? The answer hit her like a physical blow. Education. Exactly. An educated population is a population that asks questions, demands accountability, recognizes when they're being cheated. An educated population doesn't sell their land for half what it's worth and slink away in the night. Clara sank onto one of the small chairs, her mind reeling. You think someone is deliberately trying to keep Willow Bend ignorant? I think someone wants this town empty, and your little school represents a threat to that plan. The implications were staggering. For 2 years, Clara had fought against indifference, poverty, and the simple entropy that seemed to afflict frontier towns. She'd never imagined she might be fighting against deliberate sabotage. Who would do such a thing? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. Someone with enough money to buy politicians and enough patience to wait for what they want. Someone who sees Willow Bend not as a community, but as an obstacle to something bigger. Jake Morrison, Clara said suddenly. He's been the most vocal opponent of the school, and he has money. His ranch is one of the largest in the area. Morrison's a possibility, Matthew agreed, but he's not smart enough to orchestrate something this complex. This requires planning, connections, legal expertise. He paused. It requires the kind of resources my family has. The suggestion hung between them like an accusation. Clara studied Matthew's face, searching for signs of deception. Your father. I don't know. Maybe. He's certainly capable of it, and he's never been sentimental about small towns or small people. Matthew's jaw tightened. But if he is involved, he's kept it from me. Would he tell you? Probably not. He thinks I'm a wastrel who can't be trusted with serious business. There was bitterness in Matthew's voice that Clara had never heard before. Are you? Matthew looked at her sharply, then his mouth curved in a humorless smile. Until a week ago, I would have said yes, but something about this place, about you and your impossible dream, it makes a man want to be better than he is. Clara felt something shift between them. A subtle change in the quality of the air. This was no longer just about a building or even a marriage of convenience. This was about taking a stand against forces that would crush hope itself. So, what do we do? She asked. Matthew's expression hardened with determination. We build your school anyway. We find another piece of land, we get the materials, and we show this town that not everything is for sale. And if you're right, if someone is deliberately working against us? Matthew's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip, a gesture so natural Clara barely noticed it. Then they'll learn that Matthew Calder isn't as soft as they think. Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street where her students would walk tomorrow morning, their faces bright with the promise of learning. Somewhere out there, in the gathering dusk, forces were aligning against everything she'd worked to build. There's something else, she said quietly. If we're going to fight this battle together, you should know that I didn't come to Willow Bend just for the adventure of teaching on the frontier. Matthew moved closer, his spurs silent on the wooden floor. No, I came here because I failed. The admission tasted bitter in her mouth. I had a position at a prestigious girls' academy in Philadelphia. I was engaged to a successful lawyer, living the life my parents had planned for me. But I couldn't stand watching privileged girls receive the finest education while children in the city's slums went hungry for knowledge. So you left. I started volunteering at a settlement house, teaching immigrant children after my regular duties. When the academy's board discovered what I was doing, they gave me an ultimatum. Abandon the charity work or lose my position. And your fiancé? Clara's laugh was hollow. Richard made it clear that a man in his position couldn't afford a wife with radical ideas about education and social justice. He said I could pursue my little crusade after we were married, as long as I was discreet about it. But you chose differently. I chose to come west, where I thought I could make a real difference, where children's minds were hungry for knowledge and I could feed them without having to hide my work like some shameful secret. Clara turned to face him. I failed those children in Philadelphia, Matthew. I won't fail the children here. Matthew was quiet for a long time, studying her face in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. You didn't fail anyone, Clara. You chose integrity over comfort. That's not failure, that's courage. The simple kindness in his words nearly undid her. Clara had spent 2 years telling herself that her exile to Willow Bend was penance for her cowardice, that she was paying for her inability to fight effectively within the system. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Matthew said with a wry smile. "The wastrel heir and the failed teacher taking on forces we can't even see. Perhaps that makes us the perfect team." Matthew nodded slowly. "Perhaps it does." Outside, night was falling over Willow Bend, bringing with it the promise of winter and the certainty of harder times ahead. But inside the stable, surrounded by the tools of learning and the dreams they represented, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt ready for a fight. Clara's lesson plans had always been her refuge. Each evening, by the light of her oil lamp in her small boarding house room, she would carefully write out the next day's instruction in her neat penmanship. Mathematics problems that built upon previous knowledge, history lessons that connected past events to present circumstances, his literature selections that would expand young minds, every detail planned with the precision of a military campaign. Tonight, however, the pages before her held more than academic objectives. They contained her dreams for what education could become in Willow Bend, once Matthew succeeded in building their school. She had sketched out curricula that would take her students far beyond basic literacy and arithmetic. Advanced mathematics for those with aptitude, natural sciences with hands-on experiments, geography lessons that would expand their understanding beyond the dusty streets of their frontier town. In the margins, she had noted which books she would need to order, which supplies would be required, how many hours each subject should receive. It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, for a town like Willow Bend. But as Clara carefully blotted the ink and closed her leather-bound planning book, she felt a surge of hope she hadn't experienced since her first day in the stable classroom. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Clara had just begun the daily arithmetic lesson when she heard the creak of wagon wheels outside. Through the gaps in the stable walls, she glimpsed 2 figures approaching, Matthew Calder and an older man she didn't recognize. Matthew entered with his usual confident stride, but there was something different about his demeanor, a seriousness that replaced his typical casual arrogance. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching his hat brim, "I'd like you to meet Samuel Porter. He's a master carpenter from Denver." The older man stepped forward, removing his wool cap to reveal graying hair and kind eyes set in a face weathered by decades of honest work. "Pleasure, Miss Whitmore. Matthew's told me about your situation here." Clara glanced at her students, who were watching the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. "Children, please continue with your arithmetic while I speak with these gentlemen." She moved toward the door, and the 2 men followed her outside into the crisp morning air. "Mr. Porter has experience building schools," Matthew explained. "I thought he should see what we're working with." Samuel Porter walked slowly around the stable, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the structure. He examined the foundation, tested the stability of the walls, and peered up at the roof with the thoroughness of a physician examining a patient. "It's sturdy enough," he said finally. "Henderson built this place to last, but it's no schoolhouse, that's certain." He looked at Clara with sympathy. "You've done wonders with what you have, ma'am, but these children deserve better." "That's exactly what I told her," Matthew said. "The question is, can we give it to them?" Porter rubbed his bearded chin thoughtfully. "With the right materials and enough time, we can build you a schoolhouse that'll stand for 50 years. But it won't be cheap, and it won't be easy. Lumber costs have been rising all summer, and skilled labor's hard to come by out here." "What about the Henderson property?" Clara asked. "Have you heard anything from Missouri?" Matthew's expression darkened. "Got a telegram yesterday. Henderson's nephew isn't just refusing to sell, he's decided he wants the property surveyed and cleared for development. Gave us 30 days to vacate the stable." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. 30 days? But the children need to continue their education. Where will we hold classes? That's what we need to figure out, Matthew said. Porter here thinks he might have a solution. The carpenter nodded. I've been talking to folks in town, getting a sense of the situation. There's an old Methodist church about 2 miles north of here, been abandoned for 3 years now. Building's sound, just needs some work to make it suitable for classes. 2 miles, Clara said slowly. That's too far for the younger children to walk, especially in winter. It's not perfect, Matthew admitted, but it might be temporary shelter while we sort out the land situation and get materials together for a permanent school. Clara looked back at the stable, where she could hear Sarah Fleming's voice leading the other children through their multiplication tables. For 2 years, this ramshackle building had been her kingdom, the place where she'd fought daily battles against ignorance and despair. The thought of abandoning it felt like surrender. There might be another option, Porter said quietly, though it's not one you're going to like. Matthew and Clara both turned to him expectantly. Jake Morrison stopped by my hotel last night, offered me work repairing his ranch buildings, said he'd pay top dollar for quick service. Porter's expression was troubled. But he also mentioned that he'd heard about your school project, Miss Whitmore, said it was a shame to waste good money on something the town didn't really need. Morrison, Matthew muttered. I should have known he'd stick his nose into this. He made me an offer, Porter continued. Said if I could convince you two to abandon the school project, he'd recommend me for a big construction job with some associates of his in Denver. Enough work to keep me busy all winter. Clara felt anger rise in her chest. And what did you tell him? Porter smiled grimly. I told him I don't take bribes from men who think children don't deserve an education. But it made me realize something. There are people in this town who want your school to fail, and they're not going to be subtle about it. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. It's worse than I thought, he said finally. Morrison's not just opposing us, he's actively working to sabotage the project. Which means we need to move carefully, Clara said. We can't afford any more setbacks. Actually, Porter said, it means we need to move quickly. The longer this drags out, the more time they have to create obstacles. He looked at Matthew. You still determined to see this through? Matthew's jaw tightened. More than ever. Then here's what I propose. We start with the basics, secure a temporary location, order materials, and begin construction while we sort out the legal issues. If we work fast and keep our plans quiet, we might be able to present them with a fait accompli before they can stop us. Clara felt a flutter of hope mixed with apprehension. You think it will work? I think it's our best chance, Porter replied. But it's going to require some compromises. The temporary school won't be perfect, and we'll have to be very careful about who we trust. Matthew nodded slowly. What do you need from us? First, I need a detailed list of everything you want in the final building. How many students, what kind of facilities, special requirements. Second, I need you to quietly secure agreements from parents who'll support the school. Third, Porter looked directly at Matthew. I need you to be prepared for this to cost more than you originally planned. If we're fighting opposition at every turn, everything gets more expensive. Clara pulled her lesson plan book from her bag. I have detailed specifications right here. I've been working on them for months. Porter took the book and flipped through the carefully written pages, his eyebrows rising with each specification. This is impressive work, Miss Whitmore. Very thorough. He looked up at her with new respect. You've thought of everything. I've had plenty of time to dream, Clara said softly. Dreams are good, Porter replied, but turning them into reality that takes something more. Matthew stepped forward. It takes commitment and money, both of which I'm prepared to provide. And it takes courage, Clara added, the courage to stand up to people who profit from keeping others ignorant. Porter closed the lesson plan book and handed it back to Clara. Then I think we understand each other. I'll start making inquiries about materials and labor. Quietly. He looked at Matthew. Can you handle the financial arrangements without involving your father? I have access to my own accounts, Matthew said. Enough to get us started anyway. Good. And Miss Whitmore, I'll need you to keep teaching as if nothing's changed. We don't want to alarm the opposition until we're ready to move." Clara nodded, though her heart was racing. The thought of continuing her daily routine while secretly preparing for such a momentous undertaking felt almost surreal. As Porter prepared to leave, he turned back to them one final time. "There's something else you should know. Morrison wasn't the only one who approached me yesterday. I also had a visit from a gentleman claiming to represent some Denver investors. Didn't give his name, but he made it clear that certain people have big plans for this area." "What kind of plans?" Clara asked. "The kind that don't include schools or teachers or children learning to read." Porter's expression was grim. "The kind that require empty towns and desperate people willing to sell their land for pennies on the dollar." After Porter left, Matthew and Clara stood in the morning sunlight, the weight of their undertaking settling over them like a heavy cloak. "Are we doing the right thing?" Clara asked quietly. Matthew looked at her, then at the stable where the sound of children's voices drifted through the weathered walls. "I don't know if it's right," he said finally, "but I know it's necessary, and sometimes that's enough." Clara nodded, clutching her lesson plan book against her chest. Inside those pages lay not just academic objectives, but the hopes and dreams of every child in Willow Bend. Whatever forces were arrayed against them, whatever obstacles lay ahead, she would not let those dreams die without a fight. The brass bell in her hand caught the morning light, its tarnished surface gleaming with promise. Soon, she hoped, it would ring from a proper bell tower, calling children to lessons in a real school. But first, they would have to survive the battle that was coming. The foundation stones were harder to come by than Matthew had anticipated. He'd spent 3 days riding to quarries within a 50-mile radius, only to find that good building stone commanded premium prices, prices that seemed to climb higher each time he mentioned Willow Bend. On the 4th day, he discovered an abandoned homestead 15 miles northeast of town, where a failed farmer had attempted to build a stone house before giving up and heading back east. The foundation had been laid but never used, and the stones were exactly what Clara's school needed. Matthew spent the better part of a week hauling the stones back to town in his wagon, making trip after trip under the blazing September sun. His hands, soft from years of leisure, developed calluses. His back ached from lifting and loading. But with each stone he placed in the growing pile behind the livery stable, he felt something he'd never experienced before, the satisfaction of honest work. Clara often appeared during his afternoon hauling trips, bringing water and sometimes staying to help load the smaller stones. She had shed the formal reserve that had characterized their early interactions, and Matthew found himself looking forward to these moments of shared labor. "You don't have to do this," he told her one afternoon, as she struggled with a particularly heavy stone. "This isn't women's work." Clara paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Education isn't women's work either, according to most people, but that doesn't stop me from doing it." Matthew grinned and moved to help her with the stone. "Fair point, though I have to say, you're stronger than you look. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania before my father's business succeeded enough to send me to teaching college. I know how to work." They lifted the stone together, their hands brushing as they maneuvered it into place. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Matthew, and he found himself studying Clara's profile as she concentrated on the task. "Tell me about your family," he said as they walked back toward the quarry pile. Clara was quiet for a moment. "My father built a successful grain merchant business through sheer determination and honest dealing. He wanted his children to have opportunities he never had, so he sacrificed to give my brother and me the finest education money could buy. And instead of marrying well and living comfortably, you came west to teach in a stable." "My father was disappointed," Clara admitted. "He said I was wasting the advantages he'd worked so hard to provide. He couldn't understand why I would choose hardship when comfort was within reach. Do you ever regret it?" Clara picked up another stone, testing its weight. "Every morning when I wake up in my boarding house room and hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls, Every evening when I'm too tired to do anything but fall into bed, every time I see a child's face light up with understanding and know that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Matthew stopped walking. That's not an answer. Clara set down the stone and faced him. Yes, it is. Regret and purpose can exist in the same heart, Matthew. I regret disappointing my family. I regret the comfort I've given up. I regret that I can't do more for these children with the resources I have. But I don't regret the choice itself. Even if the school fails, even if we can't overcome whatever forces are working against us, especially then. Clara's voice carried a quiet conviction that made Matthew's chest tighten. Because at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have stood up and said that these children matter. That evening, Matthew sat in his father's study at the Calder Ranch, nursing a whiskey and staring into the fire. His father, Robert Calder, occupied the chair across from him, reviewing ledgers with the meticulous attention that had built their cattle empire. "You've been spending a lot of time in town lately," Robert said without looking up from his papers. "The school teacher has agreed to marry me. We're planning the wedding." The lie came easily to Matthew's lips, though it left a bitter taste. "Clara Whitmore." Robert finally looked up, his pale blue eyes calculating. "She's an educated woman. Good breeding, I'm told. It's a sensible choice. I thought you'd approve." "I do, though I understand she has some radical notions about education and social improvement." Matthew kept his expression neutral. "Nothing that marriage won't cure." Robert nodded approvingly. "Women often have idealistic phases before they settle into their proper roles. A strong husband can guide them past such foolishness." "Of course." Matthew took another sip of whiskey, using the pause to control his anger. "Speaking of property, I've been thinking about that land near town, the Henderson place. Might be worth acquiring for development. That land has already been spoken for." The casual statement sent ice through Matthew's veins. "Oh? There are investors interested in the entire Willow Bend area, progressive men with vision for the territory's future." Robert returned to his ledgers. "The Henderson property is part of a larger acquisition plan." "What kind of plan?" "The kind that doesn't concern you, son. Your job is to marry the school teacher, settle down, and learn to run this ranch properly. Leave business matters to those who understand them." Matthew finished his whiskey in silence, his father's dismissive tone confirming his worst suspicions. Robert Calder was involved in the conspiracy against Willow Bend, possibly leading it. The next morning brought troubling news. Samuel Porter appeared at the stable as Clara was beginning the day's lessons, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Someone's been asking questions about our lumber orders." Clara dismissed the children for an early recess and joined Porter and Matthew behind the building. "What kind of questions?" Matthew asked. "The kind that suggests someone wants to know exactly what we're planning to build and how much it's going to cost." Porter pulled a folded telegram from his pocket. "This came for me yesterday at the hotel, from the lumber company in Denver." Matthew read the telegram aloud. "Orders on hold pending verification of payment source and project authorization. Please provide additional references and territorial permits before shipping proceeds." "Permits?" Clara asked. "What permits?" "That's just it," Porter said. "There are no special permits required for building a school in Willow Bend. Someone's been spreading lies to create delays." Matthew crumpled the telegram in his fist. "Morrison. Maybe, or maybe whoever's been buying up property around here." Porter looked at both of them seriously. "Either way, it means they know what we're doing, and they're taking steps to stop us." Clara felt her carefully constructed plans crumbling. "So what do we do?" "We adapt," Matthew said grimly. "Porter, can you find alternative suppliers? Maybe smaller companies that won't be as easily influenced?" "I can try, but it'll cost more, and we'll have to pay cash up front. No credit, no guarantees." "How much more?" Porter consulted a notebook he pulled from his vest pocket. "Maybe 30% over what we originally budgeted, possibly more if we have to go with really small suppliers." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, calculating, "I can cover it. Barely. but there won't be any margin for error. There's something else, Porter said reluctantly. I've been asking around about workers, men I could trust to help with construction. Most of the good carpenters in the area have suddenly found themselves with other commitments, work that pays better and doesn't involve building schools. Clara sank onto a pile of lumber that had been delivered the week before one of their few successful acquisitions. They're not just opposing us, they're trying to make sure we can't succeed even if we try. Which means we need to be smarter than they are, Matthew said. Porter, what if we brought in workers from outside the area, men who don't have local connections or obligations? Possible. Expensive, but possible. I know some good men in Colorado Springs who might be willing to travel for the right wage. And what about materials, if we can't get them through normal channels? Porter grinned suddenly. Well, there are always unconventional channels. I know a fellow in Pueblo who specializes in, shall we say, creative procurement. Not everything he sells comes with proper paperwork, but it's good quality, and the price is right. Matthew raised an eyebrow. Stolen goods, surplus materials from projects that were never completed. Perfectly legal, just not obtained through traditional suppliers. Clara looked between the two men, weighing their options. How long would it take to arrange alternative sources for everything we need? 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we're lucky, Porter replied. But we'd have to commit to the whole project at once, no backing out if something goes wrong. And if we don't do this, Clara asked, if we try to work within the system, then we'll spend months fighting delays and obstacles while winter sets in and the children lose another year of education, Matthew said bluntly. Clara stood and walked to the edge of the construction site, looking out at the town where her students lived. Some of them walked past on their way to morning chores, waving when they saw her. These children trusted her to provide them with knowledge and opportunity. Could she let bureaucratic obstacles destroy that trust? There's one more thing to consider, she said finally. If we proceed with unconventional methods, we'll be giving our opponents ammunition to use against us. They'll say we're breaking the law, cutting corners, endangering the children. They're already saying worse, Matthew pointed out. At least this way, we'll have a school to show for it. Clara nodded slowly. Then we do whatever it takes. But we do it carefully, and we document everything, so there can be no questions about our methods later. Porter grinned and tipped his hat. Now you're talking like someone who really wants to see this project succeed. As Porter left to make his arrangements, Matthew and Clara stood together among the foundation stones he'd worked so hard to gather. Each stone represented hours of back-breaking labor, but also something more, a commitment to see their dream through regardless of the obstacles. Are you sure about this? Matthew asked. Once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Clara picked up one of the smaller stones, feeling its weight and rough texture. I've been sure about very few things in my life, Matthew, but I'm sure about this. These children deserve better than we've given them, and if we have to break a few rules to provide it, then that's what we'll do. Matthew nodded, understanding passing between them that went deeper than words. They were no longer just building a school, they were waging war against forces that would keep Willow Bend in ignorance and poverty, and they would use whatever weapons were necessary to win. The charred remains of their first lumber shipment still smoldered when Clara arrived at the construction site on Monday morning. The acrid smell of burned wood hung in the crisp October air, and black soot stained the foundation stones that Matthew had worked so hard to place. Samuel Porter stood amid the wreckage, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. The lumber they'd managed to acquire through unconventional channels, 2 weeks' worth of careful negotiation and premium payments, was reduced to ash and twisted metal hardware. How much did we lose? Matthew asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Everything. Siding, framing, lumber, even the finished planks for the flooring. Porter kicked at a charred beam. Whoever did this was thorough. They used coal oil to make sure it burned hot and fast. Clara knelt beside what had been their supply of window frames, now warped beyond use. The glass had cracked from the heat, creating spider web patterns that caught the morning light. Was anyone seen? Not a soul. Fire started sometime after midnight, burned for hours before anyone noticed. By then, there wasn't anything to save. Matthew's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was deliberate. Someone wanted to send us a message. Message received, Porter said dryly. Question is, what do we do about it? Clara stood slowly, brushing soot from her hands. The destruction felt personal, as if someone had burned her lesson plans or torn pages from her precious books. But beneath the grief and anger, she felt something else, a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. We start over, she said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. Matthew's eyebrows rose. Clara, the cost. We start over, she repeated, her voice stronger now. We order new materials, we hire more workers, and we build the school anyway. It'll take weeks to replace everything, Porter warned. Maybe months, depending on what we can find, and the cost will be nearly double what we originally planned. Then that's what it takes. Clara looked at Matthew, her brown eyes steady. Unless you've changed your mind about our arrangement. Matthew studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made his chest tighten. This wasn't just about education anymore. It was about refusing to be broken by forces that profited from despair. No, he said finally. I haven't changed my mind. If anything, I'm more determined than ever. Porter nodded slowly. All right then, but this time we take precautions. I'll arrange for night guards, and we'll store materials in multiple locations until we're ready to use them. And we tell no one about our suppliers or delivery schedules, Matthew added. Someone's been passing information to our enemies. Clara felt the weight of that truth. Someone in Willow Bend, possibly someone she trusted, was working against them. The thought made her feel sick, but she pushed the emotion aside. There would be time for betrayal and disappointment later. Now, there was work to do. Over the next week, the three of them worked with quiet determination to rebuild their plans. Porter contacted new suppliers, negotiating even more carefully than before. Matthew arranged for additional financing, though Clara could see the strain it was putting on his resources. And Clara continued teaching her daily lessons as if nothing had changed, even as her heart broke a little more each time her students asked when their new school would be ready. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On Friday afternoon, as Clara was cleaning the stable classroom, Mrs. Elizabeth Hawthorne appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Hawthorne was Willow Bend's unofficial social arbiter, a widow who had arrived from Boston 5 years earlier and never quite adjusted to frontier life. Miss Whitmore, she said, her voice carrying its usual tone of polite disapproval. I wonder if I might have a word. Clara set down her broom. Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne. Please, come in. Mrs. Hawthorne entered the stable with obvious reluctance, her silk dress and polished boots incongruous among the rough wooden surfaces and hay-scented air. She looked around the makeshift classroom with the expression of someone examining a particularly unpleasant medical specimen. I understand you've been having difficulties with your school project, she said without preamble. Clara chose her words carefully. We've encountered some setbacks, yes. Setbacks. Mrs. Hawthorne's laugh was bitter. Is that what you call arson? Clara's head snapped up. You know what happened? My dear girl, everyone knows what happened. The question is what we're going to do about it. Mrs. Hawthorne moved to Clara's small bookshelf and picked up a volume of Shakespeare, examining it with genuine interest. I didn't come west to watch civilization retreat before the forces of ignorance and greed. I'm not sure I understand. Mrs. Hawthorne set down the book and fixed Clara with a sharp look. I have money, Miss Whitmore. A considerable amount, inherited from my late husband's shipping business. I also have connections in Denver and Chicago business associates who owe me favors. Clara felt her heart begin to race. Are you offering to help? I'm offering to join your crusade, with conditions. What conditions? Mrs. Hawthorne smiled, and for the first time since Clara had known her, the expression seemed genuine. That we build not just a school, but a proper educational institution. Library, science laboratory, music room, everything these children would have access to in Boston or Philadelphia. Clara's breath caught. The cost! Let me worry about the cost. I have more money than I can spend in my remaining years, and I'd rather see it used for something worthwhile than left to distant relatives who never bother to write. But why? You've never shown any interest in the school before. Mrs. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Because I had a daughter once. She would have been about the age of your oldest students now. She died of scarlet fever when she was 7, back in Boston, where we had the finest doctors and the best medical care money could buy. Clara felt her throat tighten with sympathy. Before she died, Mrs. Hawthorne continued, Margaret made me promise that I would always help children learn and grow. I've been looking for the right way to keep that promise for nearly 20 years. Clara reached out and gently touched the older woman's hand. I think we can help each other keep our promises. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded briskly, her businesslike demeanor returning. Good. Then here's what I propose. I'll provide additional funding enough to build the school properly and establish an endowment for future operations. In return, I want to be involved in the planning and oversight. I want to make sure this institution reflects the highest educational standards. And if our opponents escalate their efforts to stop us, Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes hardened, then they'll discover that Elizabeth Hawthorne didn't survive 30 years in the shipping business by backing down from bullies. That evening, Clara met Matthew and Porter at the construction site to share the news of Mrs. Hawthorne's offer. Matthew whistled low when Clara explained the scope of the widow's proposed support. She's talking about enough money to build something that would rival schools in major cities, he said. Are you sure she's serious? Dead serious. She's already sent telegrams to suppliers in Chicago and St. Louis. We'll have access to materials and craftsmen that our local opponents can't touch. Porter grinned. I like this lady already. Anyone who can outflank Jake Morrison and his friends has my respect. There's something else, Clara said. Mrs. Hawthorne thinks she knows who's been working against us locally. Both men turned to her expectantly. She says Jake Morrison's been holding regular meetings with a man from Denver, someone who claims to represent territorial development interests, but who Mrs. Hawthorne recognizes from her business dealings. Who? Matthew asked. Frederick Whitman. He works for a consortium that specializes in acquiring frontier properties for railroad development. Mrs. Hawthorne says he's known for using intimidation and corruption to clear land for his clients. Matthew felt the blood drain from his face. Railroad development, exactly, which explains why they want Willow Bend empty. If a railroad comes through here, the land values will increase 100-fold. Porter whistled. No wonder they're willing to burn lumber and bribe officials. They're not just fighting a school, they're protecting a fortune. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. There's something I haven't told you both, something about my father. Clara and Porter waited. He's been having mysterious meetings lately. Men from Denver, discussions about territorial development, conversations that stop when I enter the room. Matthew's voice was heavy with the weight of unwanted understanding. I think he's involved with this Whitman and his consortium. Clara felt her heart sink. Matthew, if your father is working against us, then we'll have to be prepared to fight my own family. Matthew's jaw tightened with resolve. But that doesn't change anything. If anything, it makes this more important. Porter clapped Matthew on the shoulder. Well then, it sounds like we're not just building a school anymore. We're taking on a conspiracy that reaches all the way to Denver. Clara looked around at the construction site, imagining the beautiful school that would rise from the foundation stones Matthew had placed with his own hands. It would be more than an educational institution. It would be a symbol of resistance against forces that would sacrifice an entire community for profit. Let them come, she said quietly. Let them bring their money and their corruption and their threats. We have something they don't. What's that? Matthew asked. Clara smiled, thinking of her students' eager faces and Mrs. Hawthorne's steely determination and the foundation stones that had survived the fire intact. We have people who believe that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what they cost. As they stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the charred remains of their first attempt and the promise of their second, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Philadelphia, the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, fighting exactly the fight that mattered most. The skeletal frame of the new schoolhouse rose against the November sky, like the bones of some great beast, its timber joints and support beams creating geometric patterns that spoke of purpose and permanence. Clara stood before it each morning before classes began, watching the sun cast long shadows through the unfinished structure, imagining the day when children's voices would fill the rooms with laughter and learning. The frame was more ambitious than their original plans. Mrs. Hawthorne's financial backing had allowed them to design a building that would serve not just current students, but future generations. 2 full classrooms, a library, an office for Clara, and even space for advanced instruction in sciences and mathematics. The bell tower, rising 30 feet above the main structure, would house Clara's brass bell and serve as a landmark visible for miles. But with ambition came visibility, and with visibility came increased opposition. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore," Matthew said, examining the fresh saw marks on one of the main support beams. Someone had attempted to weaken the structure during the night, cutting halfway through a crucial joint before apparently being frightened away. Samuel Porter ran his hands along the damaged timber, his expression grim. "Another few hours with the saw, and this whole section would have collapsed when we added the roof beams." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp morning air. "They're willing to risk killing someone to stop us, which means we're getting close to something they really don't want us to have," Matthew replied. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Mrs. Hawthorne, who had arrived early to inspect the progress, adjusted her wool cloak and fixed them all with a steely look. "We post guards every night from now on. I'll hire men from Denver professionals who won't be intimidated by local threats." "That'll be expensive," Porter warned. "Everything worthwhile is expensive," Mrs. Hawthorne replied. "The question is whether we're willing to pay the price or allow ourselves to be defeated by cowards who work in darkness." Over the following weeks, the school became an armed camp. Mrs. Hawthorne's guards, 3 hard-eyed men who'd worked security for mining operations, took shifts watching the construction site. During the day, work proceeded under their watchful eyes. At night, they patrolled with rifles and lanterns, ensuring that no saboteurs could approach undetected. The precautions worked, but they came at a cost beyond money. The sight of armed guards around a schoolhouse project created tension throughout Willow Bend. Some families began to question whether Clara's educational mission was worth the conflict it had generated. "Maybe we should reconsider," said Tom Fleming one afternoon as he collected his daughter Sarah from lessons. "This whole business is getting out of hand." Clara looked at Sarah, whose bright eyes and quick mind represented everything she was fighting for. "Mr. Fleming, your daughter has the potential to attend any university in the country. Are you willing to deny her that opportunity because some people prefer ignorance to progress?" Fleming shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about ignorance, Miss Whitmore. It's about keeping the peace. This town was quiet before you started your school project." "Quiet as a graveyard," Mrs. Hawthorne interjected, appearing beside them with her usual perfect timing. "And about as full of life. Tom Fleming, you've seen what education has done for your Sarah. Are you really prepared to sacrifice her future for the sake of avoiding conflict with men who profit from this town's decline?" Fleming looked between the 2 women, then at his daughter's expectant face. "I just don't want anyone getting hurt." "People are already being hurt," Clara said gently. "Every day that passes without proper education hurts these children's chances for a better life. The only difference is that kind of hurt is invisible until it's too late to fix." Fleming nodded reluctantly and led Sarah away, but Clara could see the doubt in his eyes. If they lost parental support, the school would fail regardless of how well they defended the building. That evening, Clara sat in her boarding house room, writing lesson plans by lamplight. Outside her window, she could see the guards' lanterns moving around the construction site like fireflies in the darkness. The sight should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with unease. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Matthew standing in the hallway, his hat in his hands and a troubled expression on his face. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Clara stepped aside to let him enter, conscious of the impropriety but beyond caring about social conventions. They had moved far past the point where such considerations mattered. Matthew moved to her small window and looked out at the schoolhouse frame. "I had dinner with my father tonight." Clara felt her stomach tighten. What did he say? He knows about the guards. He knows about Mrs. Hawthorne's involvement, and he's not happy. Matthew turned to face her. "He's given me an ultimatum." "What kind of ultimatum?" "Abandon the school project, marry you quietly, and settle down to ranching. In return, he'll honor his promise to leave me the property and support our family." Matthew's jaw tightened. "If I refuse, he'll cut me off completely. No inheritance, no family support, no future in this territory." Clara sank onto her small chair, the weight of his words settling over her. "And if you agree, then the school dies. Mrs. Hawthorne's money alone won't be enough to overcome the kind of opposition he can bring to bear. He has connections throughout the territorial government, business relationships that span decades. If he decides to destroy this project, he can do it." They sat in silence for a long moment, the lamplight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara thought of all the plans they'd made, all the hope they'd built, all the children whose futures hung in the balance. "What are you going to tell him?" she asked finally. Matthew's smile was bitter. "I already told him. I said that if he wants to see this town remain ignorant and poor, he'll have to do it without my help." Clara's heart clenched. "Matthew, your inheritance." "My inheritance was built on the backs of people like the families in Willow Bend. If keeping it means abandoning those same people when they need help, then it's not worth having." He moved closer, his grey eyes intense. "Clara, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the school anymore, not entirely. It's about choosing what kind of man I want to be." "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who stands up for what's right, even when it costs him everything he thought he wanted." Matthew reached out and gently touched her hand. "The kind of man who deserves a woman like you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I never asked you to sacrifice your family for me. You didn't have to ask. Some choices make themselves." Matthew's voice was soft but firm. "The question is, are you still willing to marry a man who has nothing but his principles and a half-built schoolhouse?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the wealthy heir's facade to the man who had hauled foundation stones with his own hands, who had fought merchants and bureaucrats and his own father to build something meaningful. This wasn't the same person who had swaggered into her stable classroom weeks ago. "The Matthew Calder who made me that original proposition would never have given up his inheritance for a principle," she said quietly. "No, he wouldn't have. Which means I'm not marrying the same man who made that deal." Matthew's face fell. "Clara, I'm marrying a better one." She stood and moved closer to him, her brown eyes steady on his. "The answer is yes, Matthew. School or no school, inheritance or no inheritance, the answer is yes." The kiss that followed was nothing like their previous tentative encounters. It was filled with the passion of shared purpose, the intensity of two people who had found each other in the midst of a battle that had defined them both. When they finally broke apart, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to face this together." "Together," Clara confirmed, "whatever comes." The next morning brought news that changed everything. Jake Morrison appeared at the construction site with a dozen armed men, all wearing deputy badges that Clara suspected were as legitimate as $3 bills. "Miss Whitmore," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the work area. "I'm here on official business." Clara emerged from the school frame, where she'd been discussing window placement with Porter. The guards Mrs. Hawthorne had hired moved closer, their hands resting on their weapons. "What kind of business, Mr. Morrison?" Morrison pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "I have here a territorial injunction filed by concerned citizens of Willow Bend, demanding that construction cease immediately pending a full investigation of building permits and land ownership." Porter stepped forward. "Let me see that document." Morrison handed over the papers with obvious satisfaction. Porter read them quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is legal," he said quietly to Clara, "signed by a territorial judge in Denver. We have to stop work immediately or face arrest." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. On what grounds? Failure to obtain proper permits, construction on disputed land, and Morrison's smile was malicious, endangering the public welfare by employing armed guards in a residential area. Mrs. Hawthorne appeared beside Clara, her face pale but determined. "How long does this injunction last?" "Until a full hearing can be conducted. Could be weeks, could be months." Morrison looked around at the half-completed structure with satisfaction. "Course, winter's coming. Hard to say what condition this frame will be in come spring, exposed to the elements for months on end." Clara stared at the schoolhouse that represented so much hope and sacrifice. The frame that Matthew had helped build with his own hands, the foundation stones he'd hauled from miles away, the dreams of every child in Willow Bend, all of it held hostage by legal technicalities and corruption. "There's one more thing," Morrison said, clearly enjoying himself. "The injunction specifically names Miss Clara Whitmore as being prohibited from conducting any educational activities on the property pending resolution of the legal issues." "You're shutting down the school entirely," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm enforcing the law, ma'am. Nothing personal." But Clara could see in Morrison's eyes that it was very personal indeed. This was about more than railroad development or property values. This was about power, and about ensuring that certain people stayed in their place. As Morrison and his men rode away, Clara stood among the timbers and stones that had once represented such promise. The skeletal frame stretched above her like the remains of a dream, beautiful in its incompleteness and heartbreaking in its vulnerability. "It's not over," Matthew said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "Isn't it?" Clara gestured at the construction site, now legally forbidden to them. "How do we fight an entire system designed to keep us from succeeding?" Mrs. Hawthorne stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "We don't fight the system, my dear. We go around it." Clara and Matthew both turned to her. "I still have contacts in Washington," Mrs. Hawthorne continued. "Federal education initiatives, territorial development oversight, congressional committees concerned with Western progress. This injunction may stop us locally, but there are higher authorities who might take a different view of the situation." Porter nodded slowly. "And in the meantime?" Clara looked at the half-built school, then at the faces of the people who had become her allies in this impossible fight. An idea was forming in her mind, dangerous, probably illegal, but perhaps their only hope. "In the meantime," she said quietly, "we remember that education doesn't require a building. It requires a teacher, students, and the determination to learn regardless of the obstacles." Matthew caught her meaning first. "Clara, if you're thinking of continuing classes while the injunction is in effect." "I'm thinking of doing whatever it takes to keep my promise to these children." Clara's voice carried a steel that surprised them all. "They want to stop us from building a school? Fine. But they can't stop knowledge itself. That's something that travels wherever we choose to take it." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled slowly. "Now you're thinking like someone who truly understands what we're fighting for." As they stood together in the shadow of their half-built dream, Clara felt something crystallize inside her. They could take away her building, her permits, even her legal right to teach. But they couldn't take away her purpose or her students' hunger for knowledge. The real battle was just beginning. The hidden contract lay spread across Mrs. Hawthorne's dining room table like evidence of a crime, which Clara was beginning to realize it essentially was. The document, discovered quite by accident when young Tommy Morrison had brought it to Clara, wrapped around his lunch, contained enough revelations to shake the foundations of everything they thought they understood about their fight. Clara read the contract for the third time, her hands trembling slightly as the full implications became clear. This isn't about railroad development at all. Matthew looked up from the survey maps that had been attached to the contract. No, it's much bigger than that. Mrs. Hawthorne set down her teacup with a sharp click against the saucer. It's about silver. The contract, dated 6 months earlier and bearing the signatures of Frederick Whitman, Jake Morrison, and Clara's heart sank Robert Calder, outlined the terms of a territorial land acquisition scheme that dwarfed anything they had imagined. The consortium, represented by Whitman, had commissioned geological surveys throughout the region, and those surveys had revealed substantial silver deposits beneath much of the land around Willow Bend. According to this, Clara said, pointing to a specific clause, they've known about the silver for nearly a year. The railroad development story was just a cover to explain why they needed to acquire so much property. Matthew studied his father's signature on the document, his face a mask of controlled anger. They weren't just trying to empty the town for railroad easements, they were planning to strip mine the entire area. And they needed the land to be worthless when they bought it, Mrs. Hawthorne added. An educated population would have recognized the signs of mineral wealth, would have demanded fair compensation for their property. But desperate, ignorant people will sell for whatever they can get. Clara felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. That's why they opposed the school so violently. Education would have given people the knowledge to recognize what was happening, the confidence to resist the pressure to sell. The survey maps painted an even more disturbing picture. Red marks indicated prime mineral sites throughout the valley, with the highest concentrations directly beneath the town of Willow Bend itself. Several properties were marked as cleared, meaning the owners had already sold and departed. Others bore the notation, pending acquisition. Look at this, Matthew said, pointing to a property marked in green. That's the Henderson place, where we wanted to build the original school. According to this survey, it sits directly on top of the richest silver vein in the entire area. No wonder they fought so hard to keep us from getting that land, Clara murmured. Mrs. Hawthorne stood and moved to her window, looking out at the town where people went about their daily lives, unaware that their homes and businesses sat atop a fortune in precious metal. The question now is what we do with this information. Clara carefully folded the contract and placed it in her bag. We expose them. We show this to everyone in town, explain what's really been happening. And accomplish what, exactly? Matthew's voice carried a bitter edge. Half the people in town are already suspicious of our motives. If we accuse prominent men like my father and Morrison of conspiracy without absolute proof, we'll look like desperate troublemakers. But we have proof, Clara protested. This contract that mysteriously appeared wrapped around a child's lunch? Mrs. Hawthorne's expression was skeptical. Any lawyer worth his fee could discredit that evidence in minutes. We need more. Matthew was studying the survey maps with growing intensity. There might be a way to get more proof. These geological surveys, someone had to conduct them. Professional surveyors, mining engineers, men who keep detailed records of their work. You think we could find the survey teams? I think we could try. This level of geological assessment requires significant resources and expertise. There can't be that many qualified teams operating in this territory. Clara felt a spark of hope. If we could find the actual survey reports, the detailed geological assessments, then we'd have proof that goes beyond a single contract, Mrs. Hawthorne finished. Scientific evidence that would be much harder to discredit. Over the next 3 days, Matthew used his remaining connections and resources to track down information about geological surveys in the region. His inquiries led him to Denver, where the Territorial Mining Office maintained records of all legitimate survey operations. What he discovered there exceeded their worst fears. The surveys were conducted by Morrison Geological Services, Matthew reported when he returned to Willow Bend, a company owned by Jake Morrison's brother in Denver. They've been systematically surveying mineral-rich areas throughout the territory, always under the cover of railroad or agricultural development projects. Clara felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So Morrison wasn't just a local conspirator, he was at the center of the entire operation. It gets worse, Matthew continued grimly. According to the territorial records, Morrison Geological has surveyed over 50,000 acres in the past 2 years. Every survey has been followed within months by massive property acquisitions through front companies controlled by Whitman's consortium. "How many communities?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked quietly. "At least a dozen that I could identify. Small frontier towns, farming communities, ranching areas, all of them now virtually empty, all of them sitting on valuable mineral deposits that were purchased for a fraction of their true worth." Clara sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. "They've been doing this for years, systematically destroying entire communities to steal their mineral wealth. And Willow Bend was just the next target on their list," Matthew said, "except they ran into something they didn't expect." "What's that?" Matthew's expression was almost admiring. "A schoolteacher who refused to give up." Mrs. Hawthorne moved to her writing desk and pulled out a sheet of fine stationery. "Then it's time that schoolteacher stopped fighting for just one school and started fighting for something much bigger." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "I mean it's time to take this information to the territorial governor, to the federal authorities, to every newspaper between here and Washington." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes blazed with determination. "This isn't just about education anymore. This is about stopping a criminal conspiracy that has destroyed dozens of communities and stolen millions of dollars worth of property from innocent people." Clara felt a chill of both fear and excitement. "Mrs. Hawthorne, if we do this, if we expose the entire operation, they'll do everything in their power to stop us." "They're already doing everything in their power to stop us," Matthew pointed out. "The difference is that now we know why." "There's something else," Clara said slowly. "If this conspiracy is as large as it appears, if it involves territorial officials and mining companies and legal manipulation on this scale, we're not just fighting Morrison and your father anymore. We're fighting people with connections to the highest levels of government." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled grimly. "Then it's fortunate that I have connections of my own." That evening, as Clara sat in her boarding house room, preparing the most important lesson plans of her life, not for her students, but for territorial authorities who needed to understand what was happening in their jurisdiction, she reflected on how completely her world had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a simple schoolteacher fighting for basic educational opportunities for frontier children. Now she was at the center of exposing a conspiracy that reached into the territorial capital and possibly beyond. The brass bell on her dresser caught the lamplight, its tarnished surface gleaming with the promise it had always represented. But that promise had evolved. It was no longer just about calling children to lessons in reading and arithmetic. It was about calling an entire territory to account for the systematic theft of its people's futures. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Matthew standing in the hallway, his face showing the strain of the past few days. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly, "about my father." Clara stepped aside to let him enter, her heart already sinking with dread. "I confronted him tonight, showed him copies of the contracts and survey reports." Matthew moved to her window, staring out at the darkness. He didn't deny any of it. "What did he say?" "He said that the Western territories are full of people too ignorant or too weak to make use of the resources under their feet. He said that if they were foolish enough to sell valuable property for a fraction of its worth, that was their problem, not his. Clara felt a surge of anger. And the lies? The deception? The deliberate efforts to keep people ignorant so they could be cheated? He called it business, said that information is just another commodity, and that people who don't bother to educate themselves deserve whatever happens to them. Matthew's voice was hollow. He actually seemed proud of the operation, said it was the largest mineral acquisition project in territorial history. Clara moved to stand beside him at the window. "I'm sorry, Matthew. I know how much you hoped." "I hoped he was better than he is," Matthew said simply, "but I'm not surprised by what he turned out to be. What surprises me is what I've turned out to be." Clara looked at his profile in the lamplight, seeing the man who had emerged from the crucible of this fight. "And what's that?" Matthew turned to meet her eyes. "Someone who's finally learned the difference between having wealth and having worth." Outside their window, the half-built schoolhouse stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its frame reaching upward like an act of defiance against the forces that would tear it down. Soon, Clara knew that defiance would need to become something more. It would need to become a declaration of war against corruption itself. Tomorrow, they would begin the fight that would determine not just the fate of Willow Bend, but the future of every community that powerful men saw as nothing more than obstacles to their greed. The brass bell would ring again, but this time it would be calling more than children to lessons. It would be calling justice to account. The telegraph message that changed everything arrived on a cold December morning when frost covered the windows of the Willow Bend telegraph office like lace curtains made of ice. Clara stood beside the operator as he transcribed the coded response from Washington, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of what the message represented. "Federal investigation authorized," the telegraph operator read aloud, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. "Territorial marshal en route with enforcement authority. Maintain current positions. Evidence secured. Signed, Department of Interior." Mrs. Hawthorne, who had been pacing the small office like a caged lioness, stopped and fixed Clara with a triumphant look. 3 weeks from initial contact to federal response. I do believe that's a record. Clara folded the telegram carefully and placed it in her bag beside the original contracts and survey reports they had discovered. "The marshal is really coming?" "With full federal authority to investigate territorial mining fraud," Mrs. Hawthorne confirmed. "My contacts in Washington were very interested in the scope of what we uncovered. Apparently, there have been similar reports from other territories, but never with this level of documentation." Matthew, who had been standing quietly by the window watching for signs of trouble, turned to face them. "How long do we have before they arrive?" 3 days, maybe 4 depending on weather, the telegraph operator said. "Message says they're traveling with a full investigative team." Clara felt a mixture of relief and terror. For weeks, they had been gathering evidence and building their case, working in secret while maintaining the pretense of having abandoned their school project. The injunction against construction remained in effect, but Clara had continued teaching in hidden locations throughout the town, sometimes in the church basement, sometimes in families' homes, always moving to stay ahead of Morrison's surveillance. "Morrison and your father know something's wrong," Clara said to Matthew. "They've been asking too many questions, pushing too hard for people to finalize property sales." Matthew nodded grimly. "My father tried to get me to leave town yesterday, said there was going to be trouble, and that I should distance myself from the situation before it got worse." "Which means they suspect we've found evidence of their operation," Mrs. Hawthorne concluded. "The question is, how far are they willing to go to protect themselves?" The answer came sooner than any of them expected. That afternoon, as Clara was teaching a small group of children in the Fleming family's parlor, young Tommy Morrison burst through the door without knocking. "Miss Whitmore," he gasped, his face pale with terror, "you got to come quick. They're fixing to burn down the school frame tonight." Clara felt her blood turn to ice. "Who told you this?" "I heard my pa talking to Mr. Whitman and some other men." They said if they can't stop the federal people from coming, they're going to make sure there's nothing left for them to investigate. Tommy's voice cracked with emotion. They're going to burn everything, the school, your books, even the stable where you used to teach. Sarah Fleming stood up from her arithmetic lesson, her young face filled with determination. We can't let them do it. Sarah, this isn't something children should be involved in, Clara said gently. Those are our books, Sarah replied firmly. That's our school. If grown-ups are going to destroy it, then we have a right to try to stop them. Clara looked around at the faces of her students, children who had grown up during this fight, who had seen their educational future threatened and defended, who understood better than most adults what was at stake. You're right, she said quietly. It is your school, but stopping them will be dangerous work for adults, not children. What about the books? Asked 10-year-old Annie Morrison, Tommy's sister. All those beautiful books Mrs. Hawthorne bought for the library. Are we just going to let them burn? Clara's heart clenched. The books Mrs. Hawthorne had ordered from Chicago and Boston represented more than educational materials. They were symbols of hope, promises of the future these children deserved. The thought of watching them burn was almost unbearable. We'll save what we can, she promised. But you children need to stay home tonight, where it's safe. Within an hour, Clara had assembled their core group of allies in Mrs. Hawthorne's parlor. Matthew, Samuel Porter, and the 3 guards Mrs. Hawthorne had hired sat around the mahogany table, their faces grim as they planned their defense of the school site. They'll come after dark, Porter said, consulting a pocket watch. Probably around midnight when the town's asleep. Morrison's not stupid. He knows that if people see him burning down a school, even his supporters might turn against him. How many men will they bring? Matthew asked. Hard to say. At least a dozen. Maybe more if they're serious about this. Porter looked at Mrs. Hawthorne's guards. Can your men handle those odds? The lead guard, a scarred veteran of mining camp disputes, nodded slowly. Depends on whether we're trying to capture them or just drive them off. Drive them off, Clara said firmly. We're not vigilantes. We just need to protect the school until the federal marshals arrive. Mrs. Hawthorne leaned forward, her eyes bright with strategic thinking. What if we don't just defend the school? What if we use this opportunity to gather more evidence? Matthew raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean that if Morrison and his associates are desperate enough to resort to arson, they might be careless enough to provide us with witnesses to their crimes. Imagine how much stronger our case would be if we could present federal investigators with proof that these men were willing to burn down a school to cover their tracks. Clara felt a chill of both excitement and fear. You're talking about setting a trap. I'm talking about being prepared for an opportunity, Mrs. Hawthorne corrected. If they come to burn the school, we'll be ready to document their crime as well as prevent it. Porter rubbed his beard thoughtfully. It's risky. If something goes wrong, people could get hurt. People are already being hurt, Matthew said quietly. Entire communities have been destroyed by these men. If we have a chance to stop them permanently, shouldn't we take it? Clara thought about her students' faces, about the future that hung in the balance, about all the communities that had already fallen victim to this conspiracy. What would we need to do? Mrs. Hawthorne smiled grimly. We'd need to be very clever and very brave. The plan they developed over the next 2 hours was indeed both clever and dangerous. They would use the school frame itself as bait, making it appear undefended while actually positioning observers and guards throughout the area. Mrs. Hawthorne had contacts in the territorial government who could provide official observers to witness any crimes committed. Porter knew photographers who could document the evidence even in darkness. Most importantly, they would position themselves to overhear and record any conversations between the conspirators during the attack. If Morrison and Whitman discussed their broader operation while they thought they were unobserved, that testimony could be invaluable to federal investigators. There's one more element we need to consider, Clara said as they finalized their preparations. What if they succeed? What if, despite our best efforts, they manage to burn down the school? The question hung in the air like smoke from an unwelcome fire. Then we rebuild, Matthew said simply. We take whatever evidence we gather tonight, we present it to the federal authorities, and we use the resulting prosecutions to build an even better school on the ashes of the old one. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded approvingly. My dear Clara, you've surrounded yourself with people who understand that some fights are worth having, regardless of the immediate outcome. As the sun set over Willow Bend that evening, Clara stood once more before the skeletal frame of their school. Tomorrow, federal marshals would arrive to investigate the conspiracy they had uncovered. Tonight, local conspirators would attempt to destroy the evidence of their own crimes. In a few hours, she would discover whether months of careful planning and sacrifice had been enough to protect not just a building, but the principle it represented. That knowledge belongs to everyone, and that no amount of wealth or power gives anyone the right to steal it from those who need it most. Clara checked the brass bell in her bag one final time. If all went well, by dawn it would be calling children to classes in a school that had survived the worst its enemies could inflict. If all went badly, it might be tolling for dreams that had died in flames, lit by greed. Either way, she thought as she took her position in the darkness, the fight would be decided before morning broke over Willow Bend. The education of an entire community, and possibly an entire territory, hung in the balance of the next few hours. The bell tower stood against the midnight sky like a sentinel watching over dreams that refused to die. Clara crouched behind a stack of lumber 50 yards from the school frame, her heart hammering as she watched shadowy figures approach through the darkness. 12 men, maybe more, moving with the careful stealth of those accustomed to working outside the law. Jake Morrison's voice carried clearly in the still air as he directed his men around the construction site. Soak the frame first, then the lumber pile. We want this to burn hot and fast, nothing left but ashes by morning. Clara clutched her notebook, ready to record every word that might serve as evidence. Beside her, one of Mrs. Hawthorne's guards crouched with a camera, its flash powder prepared for the crucial moment when they would need photographic proof of the crime in progress. "What about the books?" asked a voice. Clara didn't recognize one of the men from Denver, probably. "Burn them all," Morrison replied. "Can't have federal investigators finding evidence of what kind of education that woman was planning to provide." Frederick Whitman emerged from the shadows near the bell tower, his expensive clothes and careful bearing marking him as the leader of this midnight conspiracy. "Remember, this has to look like an accident. Careless workers, improperly stored materials, winter conditions. No one can prove this was deliberate." "What if someone sees us?" asked another voice. "Who's going to see us? The whole town knows to stay away from this project." Calder's guards disappeared yesterday, probably realized their employer couldn't pay them anymore. Whitman's laugh was cold and satisfied. By morning, there won't be anything left of Clara Whitmore's little crusade, but smoke and memories. Clara felt rage boil in her chest. These men spoke of destroying her life's work as casually as they might discuss burning trash. To them, education was nothing more than an obstacle to their profits, children's futures nothing more than collateral damage in their quest for silver. The arsonists worked with practiced efficiency, pouring coal oil on the wooden frame and stacking kindling around the base of the structure. Clara watched in horror as they soaked the pile of books destined for the school library volumes of literature, science, and history that Mrs. Hawthorne had carefully selected to inspire young minds. "Signal Porter," she whispered to the guard beside her. The man raised a small mirror, catching moonlight and flashing it toward the position where Samuel Porter waited with more cameras and witnesses. The plan was working perfectly. They were documenting every aspect of the crime. Then everything went wrong. Morrison struck a match and held it high, the small flame casting dancing shadows on his weathered face. "For the future prosperity of this territory," he said with mock solemnity, "and for keeping simple people in their proper place." As he lowered the match toward the coal oil-soaked timber, a child's voice rang out across the construction site. "Stop! Don't burn our school!" Clara's blood turned to ice as she saw Sarah Fleming running toward the school frame, her small figure illuminated by Morrison's match. Behind her came Tommy Morrison, Annie Morrison, and 3 other children, her students, the children she had tried so desperately to keep safe. Morrison's men spun toward the unexpected interruption, several reaching for weapons. The match fell from Morrison's startled hand, igniting a small patch of oil-soaked ground with a whoosh of flame. "Sarah, run!" Clara shouted, abandoning her hiding place and sprinting toward the children. "It's the schoolteacher," Whitman yelled. "Grab her!" What followed was chaos. Mrs. Hawthorne's guards emerged from their positions, firing warning shots over the heads of the arsonists. Morrison's men scattered, some fleeing into the darkness, while others drew guns and returned fire. The small oil fire began to spread, licking at the base of the school frame. Clara reached Sarah Fleming and swept the girl into her arms, carrying her away from the flames while scanning desperately for the other children. Tommy Morrison stood frozen in terror as one of his father's men advanced on him with a raised club. Matthew Calder appeared from nowhere, tackling the man before he could strike the boy. The 2 figures rolled across the ground, fighting desperately, while flames climbed higher up the school's wooden frame. "The books!" Annie Morrison cried, pointing at the library collection that was beginning to smoke from the spreading fire. Without thinking, Clara set Sarah down in a safe spot and ran toward the burning pile. The heat was intense, and smoke stung her eyes, but she managed to grab an armload of volumes before Porter's strong hands pulled her back. "It's too late," he shouted over the crackling flames. "The whole frame's going to go." Clara watched in despair as fire consumed the wooden skeleton they had worked so hard to build, months of planning, sacrifice, and hope disappearing in minutes of destructive fury. But then she heard something that gave her strength. The children were singing. Sarah Fleming's clear soprano rose above the sound of flames and shouting men, joined by Tommy and Annie Morrison and the other students. They sang Amazing Grace, their young voices carrying a message of hope and resilience that no fire could burn. The sound stopped the fighting as effectively as a gunshot. Morrison's men paused in their retreat, staring at the children who faced the destruction of their school with defiant song instead of tears. Even some of Morrison's hired guns lowered their weapons, seemingly shamed by the sight of children defending their right to learn. "That's enough!" A new voice commanded from the darkness. Federal Marshal William Harrison emerged into the firelight, flanked by 6 armed deputies and territorial investigators. His badge caught the flame's reflection as he surveyed the scene with professional calm. "By the authority of the United States government, I'm placing all of you under arrest for conspiracy to defraud territorial citizens and destruction of federal property." Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "Federal property? This is a private construction project on private land." Marshal Harrison pulled a document from his coat. "As of yesterday, this entire area has been designated a federal education preservation site, pending investigation of mineral rights fraud. Any attempt to damage or destroy educational facilities here is a federal crime." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. Mrs. Hawthorne's connections in Washington had provided more than just an investigation. They had provided federal protection for the school itself. "You can't prove anything," Whitman snarled, but Clara could see fear in his eyes. "Actually, we can," Clara said, holding up her notebook filled with recorded conversations. "Every word you spoke tonight, every order you gave, every crime you committed, it's all documented." The photographer stepped forward, his camera plate safely secured despite the chaos. "And we have photographic evidence of you in the act of committing arson." As the federal deputies moved to arrest Morrison, Whitman, and their accomplices, Clara found herself surrounded by her students. They looked up at her with faces streaked with soot, but shining with triumph. "We saved some of the books, Miss Whitmore," Tommy Morrison said proudly, displaying an armload of volumes he had rescued from the flames. Clara knelt down to their level, gathering them into a fierce embrace. "You saved much more than books," she whispered. "You saved the idea that education is worth fighting for." The bell tower still stood, its wooden frame blackened but intact. And in Clara's bag, her brass teaching bell waited to ring out over whatever school would rise from these ashes, a school that would be built not just on stone foundations, but on the unshakable conviction that knowledge belonged to everyone willing to fight for it. The marriage certificate lay on Marshal Harrison's field desk, like a treaty between warring nations, awaiting signatures that would unite more than two people. They would unite two causes that had become inseparable. Clara smoothed her simple grey dress, the same one she had worn to teach in the stable, and looked across the construction site where federal investigators were documenting the evidence of the previous night's crimes. Morrison sat in shackles near a federal wagon, his face a mask of defeated rage. Whitman had already been transported to Denver to face territorial prosecutors, his carefully constructed conspiracy crumbling under the weight of documented evidence. Most satisfying of all, Robert Calder had been arrested at his ranch that morning, his involvement in the mineral rights fraud proven beyond doubt by the contracts and correspondence found in his personal safe. "Quite a wedding venue," Matthew said softly, appearing beside Clara, in his best suit, the same one he'd worn when first proposing their bargain months ago. Not exactly what most brides dream of. Clara looked around at the scene that had defined their relationship, the blackened frame of their school, the foundation stones that had survived the fire, the bell tower standing sentinel over promises kept and dreams defended. "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be married," she replied honestly. "This place represents everything we've fought for together." Mrs. Hawthorne approached them, resplendent in silk, despite the rough surroundings. "The federal investigators have confirmed that the mineral deposits extend throughout the valley, just as the stolen surveys indicated. They estimate the silver alone is worth over $2 million. Matthew whistled low. No wonder they were willing to destroy entire communities to get it. "The good news, Mrs. Hawthorne continued, is that federal law requires all illegally acquired properties to be returned to their rightful owners at fair market value, including compensation for the mineral rights. The people of Willow Bend and the other affected communities will finally receive what their land is actually worth." Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "And the school?" "Ah, the school." Mrs. Hawthorne's smile was triumphant. "The federal government has designated Willow Bend as a model education community. They're providing funding not just to rebuild our school, but to establish a teacher training college that will serve the entire territory." Clara's breath caught. "A teacher training college? With you as its first dean, if you're interested. Federal salary, federal resources, and a mandate to train teachers for frontier communities throughout the West." Matthew grinned. "Congratulations, Dean Whitmore to be Calder. I think you've found your calling." Marshal Harrison approached them, his official demeanor softened by obvious satisfaction with the night's work. "If you're ready, Mr. Calder, Miss Whitmore, I can perform the ceremony. Federal marshals are authorized to conduct weddings in territorial jurisdictions." Clara nodded, then turned to look for her students. They stood in a cluster near the bell tower, their faces bright with excitement despite the soot stains from the previous night's adventure. Sarah Fleming held Clara's brass teaching bell, polished to gleaming brightness for the occasion. "Children," Clara called softly, "would you like to be part of the ceremony?" They hurried forward, arranging themselves in a semicircle around Clara and Matthew. Tommy Morrison, whose father now sat in federal custody, looked up at Clara with eyes that held no shame, only hope for a future his father had tried to steal. "We wanted to give you something," Sarah said, stepping forward with the bell, "for your wedding and for everything you've done for us." Clara accepted the bell with trembling hands, feeling its familiar weight and the smooth brass surface that had called so many children to learning. But when she looked closer, she saw that something had been added. Engraved around the bell's circumference in careful script were the words, "Education is the light that burns away ignorance. Willow Bend School, 1000 885, from your grateful students. When did you, Clara began, but her voice broke with emotion. Mr. Porter helped us, Annie Morrison explained. We worked on it while you were planning the trap for our pa and his friends. Clara looked at the children who had become the center of her world, understanding finally that she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She had not just taught them reading and arithmetic, she had taught them to value knowledge, to fight for their rights, to believe in the power of education, to transform lives. Are you ready? Matthew asked gently. Clara nodded, her heart full to overflowing. Marshal Harrison opened his leather-bound book and began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. As the marshal spoke the ancient words, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Willow Bend as a failed teacher seeking redemption. She had found instead a purpose that transcended her individual ambitions, a love that had grown from shared struggle, and a community that had rallied around the simple idea that education belonged to everyone. Do you, Matthew Calder, take Clara Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Matthew said firmly, his grey eyes steady on Clara's face, and I promise to build whatever schools she dreams of. Do you, Clara Whitmore, take Matthew Calder to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? Clara looked into Matthew's eyes and saw the man who had transformed from an aimless heir into someone willing to sacrifice everything for principle. She saw the partner who had hauled foundation stones with his own hands, who had fought corrupt officials and his own father, who had learned that true wealth came not from inheritance, but from purpose. I do, she said clearly, and I promise to teach whatever children need learning. By the power vested in me by the United States government, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marshal Harrison smiled. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Calder. The kiss was gentle and full of promise, witnessed by federal investigators, former conspirators in chains, and most importantly, by the children whose futures had been secured through months of struggle and sacrifice. As they broke apart, Sarah Fleming stepped forward and rang Clara's brass bell, its clear tone carrying across the valley like a declaration of victory. The sound echoed off the mountains and rolled through the town, calling everyone within miles to witness the moment when love and education triumphed over greed and ignorance. Mrs. Hawthorne dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I do believe that's the most beautiful wedding I've ever attended. Clara laughed, looking around at the scorched construction site that had become her cathedral, the federal marshals who had served as her wedding party, and the children who had risked everything to save their school. I think it's perfect, she said, taking Matthew's hand as they stood together in the shadow of the bell tower that had survived every attempt to destroy it. The brass bell continued to ring, carried now by eager young hands, its voice proclaiming that in Willow Bend, at least, the future belonged to those brave enough to fight for it. And in the growing light of dawn, Clara could already see the outline of the greater school that would rise from these ashes, a place where teachers would be trained and knowledge would spread like wildfire across the frontier, lighting up communities that had been kept in darkness for too long. The conspiracy was broken, the conspirators captured, and the children of Willow Bend would never again have to choose between ignorance and hope. It was, Clara thought, as she kissed her new husband once more, exactly the kind of education she had always dreamed of providing. The first diploma from the Willow Bend Teacher Training College bore the name of Sarah Fleming, class of 1891, and as Clara handed it to her former student, now a poised young woman of 18, she felt the deep satisfaction of witnessing a promise fulfilled. Congratulations, Miss Fleming, Clara said formally, though her smile betrayed her maternal pride. The children of Pine Ridge are fortunate to have such a dedicated teacher. Sarah's eyes sparkled with the same intelligence that had marked her as special during those early lessons in Henderson's stable. I learned from the best, Mrs. Calder. I hope to inspire my students the way you inspired all of us. Clara looked out over the graduation ceremony, taking place in the main hall of the college that had grown from their impossible dream. 43 new teachers sat in neat rows, ready to carry the light of education to frontier communities throughout the territory. Behind them, proud families from dozens of towns bore witness to the transformation that had begun with one woman's refusal to accept ignorance as inevitable. The building itself was a testament to what determination could accomplish. Rising 3 stories above the valley floor, its red brick walls and tall windows proclaimed the permanence of learning in Willow Bend. The bell tower at its center housed Clara's original brass bell, which still rang each morning to call students to their lessons. But now it was joined by a carillon that could be heard for 20 miles in every direction. Matthew appeared at her elbow, handsome as ever at 34, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his purpose. "Dean Calder," he said with mock formality, "your presence is requested in the library. Apparently, some very important visitors have arrived." Clara followed him through hallways lined with portraits of the college's first graduating classes, past classrooms where the next generation of teachers learned their craft, to the magnificent library that Mrs. Hawthorne had endowed before her death 3 years earlier. The shelves held over 5,000 volumes now, and plans were already underway for expansion. In the reading room, she found a group that made her catch her breath with surprise and pride. Tommy Morrison, now a successful attorney in Denver, stood beside his sister Annie, who had become one of the territory's first female physicians. With them were former students who had scattered across the West, carrying with them the education they had received in a converted stable and the values they had learned from watching their teacher fight for their futures. "We wanted to be here for the anniversary," Tommy explained, his voice carrying the cultured tones of a man who had made himself into something far different from his corrupt father. 6 years ago today, you rang that brass bell for the first time in our new school. We thought it was time for a reunion." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at the faces of men and women who had once been the children she fought so desperately to educate. "I'm so proud of all of you." "We're proud of you," Annie said gently. "Do you realize what you've accomplished? There are now 47 schools in the territory staffed by teachers trained in this college. Thousands of children who would have grown up in ignorance now have the tools to build better lives for themselves and their communities." Matthew moved to stand beside his wife, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "There's something else you should know. The territorial governor is recommending Willow Bend as the site for the new state university when we achieve statehood next year." Clara's breath caught. "A state university? Complete with schools of education, engineering, and mining," Matthew confirmed. "They want you to serve as the first president." Clara sank into one of the library's leather chairs, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had grown from her simple desire to give frontier children a proper education. "I never imagined it would become so much." "That's because you were thinking like a teacher, not a visionary," said a familiar voice from the doorway. Clara turned to see Samuel Porter, now gray-haired but still spry at 62. He had become the college's chief administrator after completing the construction of the original school, and his practical wisdom had guided the institution through its remarkable growth. "Teachers change individual lives," Porter continued, settling into a chair across from Clara. "Visionaries change the world. You did both." Through the library's tall windows, Clara could see the town of Willow Bend bustling with afternoon activity. The empty lots and abandoned buildings of 6 years ago had been replaced by thriving businesses, comfortable homes, and the prosperous bustle of a community that had discovered its purpose. The silver mines, now properly regulated and fairly compensated, provided steady employment while the college brought visitors and students from across the nation. "Do you ever regret it?" Tommy Morrison asked suddenly, "giving up the quiet life of a simple schoolteacher for all this responsibility?" Clara considered the question seriously. Her days were now filled with administrative duties, budget meetings, and correspondence with education officials throughout the country. She taught only one class per week, a seminar for advanced students on the philosophy of frontier education. Sometimes she missed the intimacy of her small, stable classroom, the daily joy of watching young minds discover the power of knowledge. "I regret that I can't spend more time in actual classrooms," she said finally. "But I don't regret the choice to fight for something larger than myself." Every teacher who graduates from this college carries forward the principle that education belongs to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. That's worth any sacrifice. Matthew squeezed her shoulder gently. "Speaking of sacrifices, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. I received a letter from my father last week." Clara looked up in surprise. Robert Calder had been released from federal prison 2 years earlier, a broken man who had lost his fortune, his reputation, and his family's respect. Matthew had refused all contact with him since the trial. "He's dying," Matthew continued quietly. "Consumption. He wanted me to know that he understands now what we were fighting for, and that he's proud of what we've accomplished." Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions, anger at the man who had tried to destroy their dreams, pity for his suffering, and sadness for the relationship that might have been possible between father and son under different circumstances. "Are you going to see him?" she asked gently. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "I think so. Not to forgive what he did, but to show him what we built in spite of his opposition. Sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding beyond your enemy's ability to comprehend." As the afternoon wore on, Clara's former students shared stories of their achievements and the communities they had helped transform. Each tale reinforced her growing understanding that the fight for education in Willow Bend had been about much more than one school or one group of children. It had been about establishing the principle that knowledge was a force for liberation, that communities could resist exploitation through understanding, and that a single determined teacher could light a flame that would spread across an entire frontier. As evening approached, and her visitors prepared to return to their various homes and careers, Clara walked them to the main entrance of the college. The brass bell in the tower above chimed 6 o'clock, its familiar voice carrying the same authority it had possessed in Henderson's stable, but now amplified by the magnificent building that housed it. "Will you ring it one more time?" Sarah Fleming asked, gesturing toward the rope that hung near the entrance. "For old time's sake?" Clara grasped the rope and pulled, sending the bell's clear voice across the valley, as she had done thousands of times before. But tonight, the sound carried special meaning. It was both an echo of the past and a promise for the future, a reminder that the fight for education was never truly finished, only passed from one generation to the next. As the last notes faded into the mountain air, Clara stood with Matthew on the steps of the institution they had built together, watching their former students disappear into the gathering dusk. Around them, the lights of Willow Bend began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a family whose children would grow up with opportunities their parents could never have imagined. "Do you think we've done enough?" Clara asked softly. Matthew pulled her closer, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I think we've done what we could with the time we were given. The rest is up to them." Clara nodded, understanding that their work was far from finished, but satisfied that they had established something that would endure long after they were gone. Somewhere in the territory tonight, a teacher trained at their college was preparing lessons for tomorrow's classes. Somewhere, a child was learning to read by lamplight, discovering that the world was larger and more wonderful than anyone had told them. The brass bell fell silent, but its message continued to resonate across the frontier. that education was indeed the light that burned away ignorance, and that as long as there were teachers willing to ring the bell and students eager to answer its call, the future would always belong to those brave enough to learn. In the growing darkness, Clara Whitmore Calder stood beside the man who had helped her build dreams into reality, content in the knowledge that they had kept their promises to the children of Willow Bend and to each other. The fight for education would continue in other places, with other teachers, but here at least, the light of learning would never be extinguished. The brass bell waited patiently in its tower, ready to ring again tomorrow morning, calling new students to discoveries that would change their lives and, in time, change the world.